There was a time when one number told you everything. 8-bit was old. 16-bit was the future. More bits meant more power, more colors, bigger sprites, better sound, and presumably a better childhood. But while Nintendo and Sega turned that number into a global war, several other consoles arrived with sharper graphics, arcade-perfect games, CD-ROM drives, and enough futuristic marketing to melt a 1991 television. Most of them vanished. One was too expensive, one was marketed like a kitchen appliance, and one launched with only 12 officially released games before costing its creator millions. But the strangest part is this: these machines did not fail because they were all bad. They failed because, during the most tribal era in gaming history, nobody knew exactly who they were for. Our story starts in Japan on October 30th, 1987, when NEC and Hudson Soft released the PC Engine. It was tiny, white, and looked almost harmless, but inside was hardware built to challenge Nintendo. Its HU6 6280 processor used an 8-bit core, while its graphics hardware could handle 16-bit operations. So yes, the machine later sold as the TurboGrafx-16 was not entirely 16-bit. Marketing had already discovered the ancient art of technical bullshit, but the games looked fantastic. Hudson's compact HuCard cartridges delivered fast arcade action, while titles like R-Type, Bonk's Adventure, Blazing Lasers, and Military Madness gave the system a real identity. In Japan, the PC Engine became a serious success and even outsold the Famicom during parts of its early life. That success gave NEC confidence to push even further, so it released the CD-ROM squared add-on in 1988, years before CDs became standard on home consoles. This thing was not behind the curve. It was leaning so far into the future that it nearly fell over. But NEC delayed the American launch until August 1989, so the machine entered a completely different battle. Sega's Genesis had arrived with a sleek black design, aggressive advertising, an altered beast packed into the box. That forced NEC to reposition its tiny Japanese console for American tastes, so executives enlarged it into the bulky TurboGrafx-16 because they apparently believed Americans would reject a machine unless it occupied the same floor space as a VCR. That redesign created size, but not confidence. The TurboGrafx came with one controller port, while the Genesis offered two. Its mascot, Bonk, was charming, but he was competing against Sega's arcade reputation and would soon face a plumber with the most powerful mustache in human history. Distribution was weaker, advertising was confused, and many American players never even saw the console in stores. TurboGrafx-16. It sounded impressive, but Sega had made 16-bit feel rebellious. NEC had made it sound like a new brand of battery. The PC Engine family eventually sold roughly 10 million units worldwide, although regional numbers are notoriously iffy. Most of that success came from Japan, while the TurboGrafx-16 remained a distant third in North America. Its lifespan was substantial, its library was excellent, and its technology was often ahead of its rivals. But outside Japan, being first was not enough. NEC had the hardware, but Sega had the attitude. That exposed one possible solution. If vague promises of higher energy could not beat Sega, perhaps a console needed an identity nobody could misunderstand. SNK took that idea to its most extreme conclusion. It would not merely imitate the arcade, it would put the actual arcade machine in somebody's house. SNK launched the Neo Geo multi-video system in Japanese arcades in 1990. Operators could install multiple games in one cabinet, so players had more choices while arcade owners saved space. Because that system was clever, powerful, and profitable, SNK created a home version using almost identical hardware. The Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System arrived in Japan in 1990 and reached North America in 1991. Technically, it was glorious. A Motorola 68000 CPU ran alongside a Z80 sound processor, massive sprites filled the screen, and the cartridges contained far more data than typical Genesis or Super Nintendo games. SNK advertised it as a 24-bit system by creatively adding numbers together, because once the bit count war began, mathematics became a contact sport. Delivering literal arcade hardware created a brutal consequence. Literal arcade prices. $99 for the gold system. Adjusted for inflation, that is well over $1,500 today. Individual games could cost around $200, which meant buying Fatal Fury felt less like purchasing entertainment and more like refinancing a small boat. Still, it delivered what it promised. Magician Lord, Baseball Stars Professional, Samurai Showdown, Metal Slug, and the King of Fighters were not watered-down conversions. These were arcade games running in your living room, complete with enormous cartridges that looked capable of surviving a direct missile strike. For me, the Neo Geo was the holy grail. You saw screenshots in magazines and stared at them like forbidden treasure. Nobody I knew owned one. Nobody I knew had even touched one. There was always a rumor that somebody's cousin had one, but that cousin usually lived 3 towns away and was never available for questioning. The AES never became a mass-market success, and reliable hardware sales remained difficult to verify, but that almost misses the point. SNK supported the Neo Geo platform until 2004, giving it one of the longest commercial lives of its generation. It failed at becoming everybody's console, but succeeded at becoming gaming's ultimate luxury object. The Neo Geo did not lose because it lacked identity, so clarity alone was not enough. A console could promise one extraordinary thing, but if ordinary families could not justify the price, it remained a fantasy. Commodore therefore pursued the opposite strategy in 1991. Instead of selling one expensive purpose, it would make one machine perform enough jobs to justify its cost. The future was not just cartridges. It was part computer, part 400 player, part educational device, and part living room entertainment center. The Commodore CDTV was essentially an Amiga 500 wearing a black suit. 16 MHz, Motorola 68000 processor, included a single-speed CD-ROM drive, and came with a remote control instead of a traditional gamepad. Commodore called it the CDTV, short for Commodore Dynamic Total Vision, which sounds less like a console and more like something sold during a late-night insurance commercial. That was deliberate. Commodore wanted the machine positioned beside the stereo and television, not next to children's toys. It could play music CDs, educational software, reference discs, and Amiga-based games. But adding more purposes did not make its purpose clearer. It created a fatal contradiction. Computer buyers saw an underpowered Amiga without a keyboard, while gamers saw an expensive black box without a recognizable game controller. The price made that confusion worse. In Britain, the CDTV launched at around £499, while the American package cost close to $1,000 depending on the configuration. So families could buy a Genesis, a stack of games, and enough snacks to survive an entire summer. Or they could buy a multimedia encyclopedia with a remote. Developers were equally uncertain because Commodore had not defined what a CDTV experience should be. Many releases were little more than existing Amiga games placed onto CDs, so the enormous storage capacity rarely produced anything that justified the cost. Estimated sales sit somewhere in the tens of thousands, although Commodore never provided a trustworthy final figure. The CDTV disappeared by 1993, but its basic idea survived. Consoles would eventually become multimedia hubs. Commodore was simply too early, too expensive, and spectacularly bad at explaining why anyone needed one. That failure should have warned the rest of the industry that multimedia was not an audience, but the dream of owning the next entertainment standard was too profitable to abandon. So Philips made almost the same bet with considerably more money and one very unfortunate relationship with Nintendo. The Philips CDI launched commercially in 1991, with early American models costing about $799. 5 MHz, played interactive CDs, offered educational programs, and could show full-motion video with additional hardware. Like Commodore, Philips did not initially present it as a game console. It was an interactive multimedia player, a phrase that sounded incredibly futuristic until you actually had to explain it to your parents. But because Philips had worked with Nintendo on a proposed CD add-on for the Super Nintendo, it gained permission to use Nintendo characters in several CDI games. That bizarre legal footnote gave us Hotel Mario, Link, The Faces of Evil, Zelda, The Wand of Gamelon, and Zelda's Adventure. You know the cutscenes, the stiff animation, the floating heads, the dialogue that has spent decades being remixed into internet memes. Nintendo normally guards its characters like nuclear launch codes, so seeing Link and Mario in these games feels like discovering official Mickey Mouse tax software. Those licenses should have given the CDI the recognizable identity the CDTV lacked, but famous characters could not repair hardware that had not been designed around games. The CDI offered interesting experiments such as Burn Cycle, The Seventh Guest, and Voyeur, but its controller, price, and limited action game hardware kept pulling in the opposite direction. Philips reportedly sold around 1 million CDI players across multiple models, yet the project is often estimated to have cost the company close to $1 billion. It lasted into the late 1990s, but never escaped the contradiction built into its design. It tried to be the future of entertainment, so nobody could tell whether that future was a game console, a movie player, or an extremely expensive encyclopedia. The CDTV and CDI proved that a machine could not become essential simply by doing several things badly. But manufacturers drew a different conclusion. Perhaps the problem was not too many formats but too little compatibility. That logic produced the most physically excessive multimedia machine yet. Pioneer released the LaserActive in 1993, a giant system that could play laser discs, karaoke discs, and special interactive games. But to play Genesis or TurboGrafx software, you needed separate pack modules costing hundreds of dollars. The base unit launched at roughly $970, while some games cost more than $100 each. Every attempt to make it more versatile also made it more expensive and complicated. Basically, the LaserActive was what happened when an electronics catalog achieved consciousness. After years of oversized machines, CD drives, remotes, expansion modules, and luxury pricing, the obvious reaction was to return to something simpler, a straightforward cartridge console built for colorful two-dimensional games. But simplicity only works if the market is still waiting for it, and the most forgotten machine of this entire story arrived after that window had closed. In 1995, Taiwanese company Funtech released the Super Akan. It used a Motorola 68000 processor, featured hardware suited to colorful two-dimensional games, and was designed as a local 16-bit competitor in Taiwan. On paper, that was reasonable. But the failures of the previous machines had consumed nearly the entire 16-bit era, so by the time Funtech entered the fight, the PlayStation and Sega Saturn had arrived. Three-dimensional graphics were becoming the new obsession, imported Japanese consoles were widely available, and piracy made it difficult for a small regional platform to build a profitable library. Because publishers saw little chance of recovering their investment, only 12 games were officially released. 12. You could fit the complete commercial library on one shelf, and still have room for your weird promotional Sonic mug. That tiny library gave customers even less reason to buy the hardware, so sales stalled, developers stayed away, and the cycle became impossible to reverse. The Super Akan reportedly lost Funtech around $6 million, and unsold hardware was eventually broken down for parts. That is the machine from our opening. A console launched near the end of the 16-bit war, just as the industry had decided polygons were the future. It was not merely in the wrong place at the wrong time. It arrived after the party, switched on the lights, and discovered everyone had already gone to Sony's house. So why did these consoles fail? Each tried to solve the problem exposed by the machine before it, but every solution created a new weakness. NEC had advanced hardware but weak positioning, so SNK built a console with absolute clarity, but priced it beyond ordinary players. Commodore tried to justify a high price through multiple uses, but that erased the machine's identity. Philips added famous characters and more multimedia ambition, but the hardware still did not know what it wanted to be. Pioneer answered confusion with compatibility, but compatibility became a tower of expensive modules. Funtech finally returned to a simple game console, but arrived years too late. Price mattered, marketing mattered, weak distribution and small libraries mattered, but all of those problems grew from the same deeper issue: identity. The Genesis promised speed and attitude. The Super Nintendo promised familiar characters and polished exclusives. Their forgotten rivals often promised technology itself. More storage, arcade hardware, multimedia, laserdiscs, raw specifications. But players do not fall in love with specifications. We fall in love with the night our friend finally beat the boss, the music from a title screen, or the cartridge we rented so often that buying it would have been cheaper. These machines lost the market, but they made the era stranger, riskier, and far more interesting. Maybe that is what we miss most. Not perfect hardware, but a time when nobody knew what a console was supposed to become. Which forgotten 16-bit machine would you bring home if price no longer mattered? Tell me in the comments, and if you enjoy exploring gaming's weirdest lost chapters with me, consider liking the video and subscribing. You'll be glad you did.